In Vlog 1, we covered philosophy as ontology. Logically, moving on from that episode, in this vlog, we're going to be covering philosophy of self. So, paradoxically, philosophy as ontology runs into a very interesting problem. It forgets about the self, or it forgets about subjectivity. In other words, philosophy as ontology has a difficult time making sense of the fact that there is always already a consciousness or an observer who's doing the investigation into the truth of being. This logically brings up the problem, what is the truth of consciousness, or what is the nature of subjectivity? The nature of subjectivity is an extremely difficult question because it totally transforms the mode of investigation. All of a sudden it goes from knowing the world to trying to know thyself. You may be aware of this famous axiom proposed by Socrates. In the transition from knowing the world to knowing thyself, we move from an external relationship to being to an internal relationship to being. This means that in order to know the truth, we can't forget about cognitive processes. We can't forget about our own minds, the way they work, and the way they are a priori structuring the way we interact with being. In other words, we have to include into our search for truth a reflexivity, an awareness. The truth is not some unreflexive, unaware thing. It includes within it reflexivity and awareness. To give a concrete example of the consequences of this shift from external to internal, we can recall that in the mode of philosophy as ontology, we develop tools of logic, tools of maths, and tools of science to try to understand being in itself as best as we can. In the shift from external to internal, we ask the question, what is logic in itself? What is mathematics in itself? What is science in itself? In other words, we're asking about the truth of the phenomenon of logic, the truth of the phenomenon of maths and science, and so forth, which totally changes the question and the mode in which we engage with these tools of knowledge. Now, one of the most obvious ways in which this changed the analysis is that instead of trying to understand objective being in some way independent of subjectivity or independent of observation, we shift to trying to understand subjectivity as an interaction with being. In other words, we try to understand the way in which thought and being relate to each other, or the way in which the subject and the object relate to each other. This brings up the possibility that what we're searching for with the truth of being also includes our knowledge. In other words, we can't just think about being in itself, independently of our knowledge, but also the way in which our knowledge has a truth for being. They're co-relating or entangled with each other. Two forms of knowledge in the last 2 centuries which have emphasized this interaction is first the philosophy of idealism in all of its various forms, and also the not quite science, but psychic and social practice of psychoanalysis. In both idealism and psychoanalysis, the interaction between thought and being and the interaction between subject and object is emphasized. And also what is emphasized is reflexivity and awareness of the object. Finally, in terms of interpretation, this means that we can't just think about an objectivity which is independent of observation. We must also wrestle with the problematics of observation. This is not just a side or a peripheral issue, but central and fundamental. What this asks of us is that we always consider that being is structured by an a priori frame. This was most famously proposed by Kant, and all post-Kantian and transcendental philosophies try to wrestle with the nature of the a priori frame, that the world always appears within the frame of an observer. There is no way, as it were, to get beyond or behind this frame of reference. The frame of reference is structuring objectivity. In terms of a concrete, practical, and real way to think about this, when we think about objectivity in the classical scientific materialist sense, we often think in terms of a type of de-emotionalized or de-passionized object of analysis. But when we always work from the a priori frame of reference, we have to think about objectivity inclusive of the fact that a cognitive process is measuring something, is using something, is desiring something, or fearing something. Other emotions like love. This means that objectivity is inclusive of our emotional valences. We don't fully understand the consequences of incorporating this mode of thinking, this philosophy of self, into our understanding of objectivity, but it is a great philosophical challenge. I hope this video was a good overview of the philosophy of self and gave you an introduction to some of the questions that philosophers interested in the self may approach. Thanks for watching, and thanks for listening.